February 19th, 2026. The Sandringham estate in Norfolk, still dark at the edges, the grounds winter bare. A man wakes in temporary accommodation on the property, not in the 30-room mansion he occupied for 2 decades, not in the palace where he was born, but in borrowed rooms on a family estate that no longer quite belongs to him. It is his 66th birthday. Before midday, British police officers are at the door. They arrest him on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He is taken into custody. He will remain there for almost 10 hours. At 2 properties linked to his name, one in Norfolk, one in Berkshire, officers begin searching rooms, opening files, documenting what they find. By the time he is released under investigation that evening, his brother, the King of England, has posted a statement to the royal household website. It does not call him brother. It uses his civilian name. It offers no defense. Its final line is 7 words long. The law must take its course. The man's name, until recently, was Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Before that, he was a war hero, a trade envoy, a father of 2 princesses, and on by most accounts, the Queen's favorite child. The world he lost did not collapse in a single night. It was disassembled over decades, title by title, residence by residence, denial by denial, while a dead man's archive kept expanding in a government vault across the Atlantic. This is the story of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. From royal birth to criminal investigation, from Buckingham Palace balcony to police custody. It spans 66 years, 2 continents, 1 friendship that should have ended with a conviction, and a family that chose the institution over the brother. The private version is worse than anything the headlines captured. But to understand how a king's brother ended up processed through ordinary criminal procedure on his own 66th birthday, you have to go back much further than the arrest warrant. You have to go back to a palace, a nursery, and a particular kind of birth. The kind that gives a child everything except a reason to exist. This is the story of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, from the Buckingham Palace balcony to the Sandringham police car, from the Queen's favorite son to a man stripped of every title the family ever gave him. And it begins not with scandal, but with something quieter and more dangerous: proximity to power without the obligation that makes power bearable. Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on February 19th, 1960, inside Buckingham Palace. He was the 3rd child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. He was the first baby born to a reigning British monarch in over a century, not since Queen Victoria's youngest child in 1857 had a ruling sovereign given birth. That detail matters, not as trivia, but as context. Andrew entered the world inside the institution itself, born literally within the palace walls, and his arrival was treated as a constitutional event. Crowds gathered outside the gates. Announcements were issued through the official channels that had been relaying royal births for generations. The child was second in line to the throne from his first breath. For 22 years, until Prince William was born in 1982, Andrew held that position, second in line, close enough to the crown to absorb its gravity, far enough from it to be spared its weight. Charles, as the eldest, inherited destiny, the title, the training, the decades of waiting, the relentless preparation for a role that would not arrive until he was 73 years old. Charles was the brother who spent his entire adult life being shaped into a vessel for duty, who could not marry whom he wished, speak freely on the topics he cared about, or step outside the corridor the institution had built for him. Anne, the only daughter, inherited discipline and a fierce independence that would carry her through decades of quiet, effective public service, with a work rate that consistently outpaced every other member of the family. Edward, born 4 years after Andrew in 1964, arrived into a family whose mythology had already hardened: the heir, the dutiful daughter, the charming second son. Edward would spend his life occupying the least defined space of all. But Andrew inherited something else entirely. He inherited charm, expectation, indulgence, and the particular freedom that comes from being important enough to matter, but not important enough to be watched. There is something about that gap worth sitting with for a moment. The heir to the British throne lives under a kind of surveillance that begins in childhood and never lifts. Every friendship is vetted. Every public word is weighed. The heir's life is in a meaningful sense not his own. But the spare, the younger brother, the one who might matter in an emergency but almost certainly never will, gets a different deal. He gets the palaces, the staff, the deference, the travel, the uniform, the access. What he does not get is the structure. And without structure, access becomes its own kind of danger. That truth would take decades to reveal itself, but it was present from the beginning, encoded in the architecture of royal birth order, like a flaw in the foundation of a house that looks solid until the ground shifts. Andrew grew up across the residences that defined the Windsor calendar: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham in Norfolk, Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. He was educated at Heathfield Preparatory School, then sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland, the same austere boarding school his father and brother had attended, perched on the coast of Moray with its cold water showers and emphasis on physical endurance. Gordonstoun was not a gentle place. It was built on a philosophy of character through hardship, cross-country runs in rain, outdoor expeditions designed to strip away the softness that wealth and title could produce. Philip had thrived there. Charles had been profoundly miserable, bullied, lonely, out of place among boys who did not share his sensitivity. Andrew, by most accounts, navigated Gordonstoun with the social ease that would define his early public life. He was likable, physically confident, popular with peers, and unburdened by the introspection that made his older brother seem fragile by comparison. Where Charles turned inward, Andrew turned outward. He had the swagger. He had the grin. He had, in the language of the British press that would follow him for decades, the makings of a playboy prince. After Gordonstoun, Andrew entered the Royal Navy. He trained at Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, beginning in 1979, following the path his father had walked decades earlier. He earned his pilot's wings in 1981, qualifying to fly helicopters at a time when the Navy still meant something hard and physical to the men who served in it. And then, in a stroke of timing that would define his public identity for the next 2 decades, he went to war. The Falklands conflict began in April 1982, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. Andrew was 22 years old, a sub-lieutenant and helicopter pilot aboard HMS Invincible, the aircraft carrier that sailed south with the task force. He flew Sea King helicopters in the South Atlantic, anti-submarine patrols, casualty evacuations, Exocet missile decoy operations that put his aircraft directly in the path of incoming Argentine fire. The war was short, brutal, and for Britain, ultimately successful. Andrew came home not merely as a prince who had served, but as a prince who had fought. That distinction carried weight in a country that still remembered its military monarchs with a particular kind of reverence. He was the handsome naval son, the war hero, the queen's boy who had risked what princes were no longer supposed to risk. The press loved him. The public loved him. For a brief and vivid period in the early 1980s, Andrew was the most popular young royal in the country. Elizabeth's pride was reportedly immense. She had sent her son to war, a decision no modern sovereign had to make, and he had returned a hero. The bond between mother and son, already strong, deepened into something the public could see and the press could narrate. Andrew was said to be the queen's favorite, the child who made her laugh, the one whose company she sought at Balmoral and Sandringham when the formal calendar allowed her to be simply a mother. Whether that was literally true, or simply a story the tabloids told and retold until it became accepted wisdom, it shaped the public understanding of his position within the family. He was protected, he was preferred, and those two things, protection and preference, would prove to be the architecture of his undoing. The Queen's protection was not sentimental, it was institutional. When Andrew made mistakes, and even in his younger years, there were stories of arrogance, of rudeness to staff, of the casual entitlement that comes from being deferred to before you have done anything worth deferring to. The palace absorbed the embarrassment, complaints were managed, stories were softened. The machinery of royal communication, which existed to project dignity and control, extended its coverage to the Queen's second son in the ways that would not have been available to a less favored member of the family. That coverage would hold for decades. It would survive his divorce, survive the early Epstein rumors, survive the first round of tabloid attacks. It would not survive the documents. But that reckoning was still decades away. In the mid-1980s, Andrew's life still looked like the version of royalty the public wanted to believe in. On July 23rd, 1986, Andrew married Sarah Ferguson at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was watched by an estimated 500 million people worldwide. Sarah was the daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, a polo manager with deep connections to Prince Charles's social circle. Aristocratic adjacent rather than royal born. Warm where the Windsors were formal. Spontaneous where the institution demanded control. She had red hair, an easy laugh, and an appetite for life that the monarchy's more buttoned up members found either refreshing or alarming, depending on the year. The wedding gave the public a love story it craved, something bright and uncomplicated after the increasingly brittle theatrics of Charles and Diana, whose marriage was already fracturing behind the official photographs. That same day, the Queen created Andrew, Duke of York, one of the most senior titles in the British peerage. The title carried generations of history. It was traditionally given to the sovereign's second son, and its previous holders included the future kings George V and George VI. Andrew stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony in his naval uniform. Sarah stood beside him in her ivory gown. They waved to the crowds below. The image was clean, bright, full of the easy confidence that makes people believe in institutions. No one looking at that photograph, the uniform, the dress, the balcony, the family arranged behind them, could have imagined that the title given that morning would be stripped away almost 40 years later, or that the balcony itself would become a place from which Andrew would eventually be excluded entirely. Their first daughter, Princess Beatrice Elizabeth Mary, was born on August 8, 1988. Their second, Princess Eugenie Victoria Helena, arrived on March 23, 1990. The York household was complete. Andrew was a father, a decorated officer, a duke, and, for the last time in his life, a man whose public image and private reality were still roughly aligned. The girls grew up in the peculiar fishbowl of minor royal childhood. Famous by birth, photographed by strangers, educated at expensive schools, shuttled between residences whose names appeared on tea towels sold in tourist shops. They were loved by parents whose marriage was already cracking under pressures the cameras could not detect, but the household staff could feel. Beatrice and Eugenie mattered to this story not as accessories, but as inheritors. They did not choose the family. They did not create the scandal. But they would spend their adult lives carrying the weight of it, the name, the photographs, the questions, the public record that attached itself to the word York and would not let go. They are the next generation of a story that was already in motion before they were old enough to understand it. The marriage did not hold. Andrew and Sarah separated in 1992, the same catastrophic year that saw Charles and Diana's separation, a devastating fire at Windsor Castle, and the Queen's own description of the period as her annus horribilis. The Yorks divorced formally in 1996. But unlike most royal divorces, the emotional architecture did not collapse entirely. Sarah remained close to Andrew. She continued living at or near his residences. The family appeared to those who watched carefully, fractured legally, but bonded privately, a domestic arrangement that confused the usual narrative of aristocratic separation. That closeness would endure for decades through scandal and disgrace and financial pressure and tabloid cruelty. It would also mean that when the worst finally came, the blast radius would include not just Andrew, but everyone who had remained in his orbit. After retiring from active naval service in 2001 after 22 years in uniform, Andrew needed a role. The monarchy has a practical problem with its spare members. They must be seen to work, must justify the residences and the staff, but their work cannot compete with the heir's work or overshadow the sovereign. The role of a royal spare is, by institutional design, decorative, and Andrew was not a man built for decoration. He became the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment. The role was, on paper, perfectly suited to a prince without a portfolio, travel, receptions, introductions, soft power. He would open doors for British businesses abroad, lend the prestige of the royal name to trade delegations and investment pitches, and perform the peculiar alchemy that only royalty can offer, turning a handshake into an event, a dinner into a signal, a photograph into proof that someone mattered. Picture the rooms he moved through. A reception in a Gulf state or a banking capital, Polished floors, name cards arranged by protocol, mineral water in canapes, men in expensive suits waiting for the moment the Duke arrived. The handshake, the photograph, the brief exchange in which the businessman could say something about his project and Andrew could nod, and the room could feel that a connection had been made. The commodity was not information, it was not advice. It was the presence of a man whose mother wore the crown. Andrew understood this transaction instinctively, and he performed it well. His value in that world was not expertise, not policy knowledge, not commercial acumen. His value was access. People wanted the photograph with the Duke of York. They wanted the dinner invitation, the palace reception, the sense, however illusory, that being near Andrew meant being near the British state. And Andrew, by all accounts, enjoyed being wanted. The first signs of trouble arrived not as scandal, but as whispered criticism. His travel expenses drew comment. His taste for luxury hotels and private jets earned him the tabloid nickname Air Miles Andy. His choice of companions raised questions. He met with the son of Muammar Gaddafi and a son-in-law of Tunisia's ousted president, men whose connections carried the odor of authoritarian patronage. Then came the Sunninghill Park sale. In 2007, Andrew sold his former marital home to a son-in-law of former Kazakh ruler Nursultan Nazarbayev for £15 million, £3 million above the asking price. No one could explain the premium. No one tried very hard to. The transaction sat in the public record like an unanswered question, not quite a scandal, not quite clean. That sale belongs here, before Epstein, because it reveals the pattern that would define Andrew's fall. It was not one friendship gone wrong. It was a way of operating. A prince who had internalized the idea that access was currency, that proximity was power, and that the rules governing ordinary public servants did not quite apply to a man born in a palace. The meetings with dictators' sons, the overpayment on a house, the trade dinners, where the real commodity being exchanged was not steel or software, but royal proximity itself, each one alone was survivable, together they formed the soil in which something far worse would take root. Jeffrey Epstein entered Andrew's world through the same social machinery that had always delivered wealthy, useful, globally connected men to the doors of royal residences. Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of disgraced British media baron Robert Maxwell, a woman who moved with ease through the overlapping circles of London society, New York finance, and aristocratic leisure, made the introduction. She was the bridge. She arranged the access. She was, in the social mechanics of the ultra-wealthy, the person who made the connection feel natural, even inevitable, and the connection went deep. Andrew would later acknowledge, in his November 2019 BBC interview, that Epstein had visited Windsor Castle, that Epstein had been to Sandringham, that Andrew had been on Epstein's private plane, that he had visited Epstein's private island in the Caribbean. These were not casual encounters at crowded parties. Epstein had been brought inside the most private geography the royal family possessed. Spaces that tourists queued for hours to glimpse from behind a velvet rope that were protected by armed officers and centuries of protocol. Andrew did not merely befriend the wrong man, he brought the wrong man home. He folded Epstein into the architecture of the institution itself. And by the time the world learned what Epstein was, the contamination had already reached the inner sanctum. There was another person entering this story whose name would not become publicly attached to Andrew's for years. Virginia Roberts was a teenager from a troubled background in Florida when, according to her later allegations and court filings, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell drew her into their orbit and trafficked her. She was 17 years old when, she alleged, she was brought to Andrew. In London, in New York, on Epstein's private island, she alleged sexual abuse. Andrew denied her claims. He denied ever meeting her, despite a widely circulated photograph that appeared to show his arm around her waist at Maxwell's London residence. That denial would hold for years, sustained by the institutional silence that the palace deployed around anything it could not manage through the usual channels of press officers and carefully worded statements. But Virginia Roberts, later Virginia Giuffre, after her marriage, was not a rumor. She was a person, not a tabloid invention, with a name and a face and a testimony that grew more detailed with every legal filing. Her voice would grow louder across the years that followed, through lawsuits, depositions, interviews, and eventually a memoir published after her death. She was the human counterweight to every institutional defense the palace would construct, and her presence in the story, The weight of what she alleged, the persistence with which she pursued accountability, would eventually pierce the royal facade in a way no newspaper investigation or parliamentary question ever had. For now, though, in the early 2000s, none of it was visible. The photographs looked right. The trade dinners went smoothly. The handshakes produced the desired outcomes. Andrew was useful, and useful men are rarely questioned until the questions become impossible to ignore. On November 29th, 2006, Jeffrey Epstein was charged in Florida with multiple counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor. He would eventually plead guilty to a lesser charge, procuring a person under 18 for prostitution. Under a controversial non-prosecution agreement, he entered custody in 2008 and was released in July 2009 after serving approximately 13 months, much of it under a work release arrangement that allowed him to leave jail during the day. The conviction was public. The registry was permanent. The implications for anyone who remained in Epstein's orbit were obvious to anyone willing to see them. What is not in dispute is this: Andrew did not walk away. Newly revealed emails would later show that on April 15th, 2010, 9 months after Epstein's release from prison, Epstein wrote to Andrew suggesting a meeting with American banker Jess Staley. Andrew replied. He said he would be outside the UK but would try to drop by New York later that year. It would be good, he wrote, to catch up in person. The language was casual, the tone of a man arranging a social call, not a man severing ties with a convicted sex offender. The friendship had not ended with the conviction. It had continued quietly, through the channels the powerful men use to maintain relationships they cannot publicly defend. In December 2010, Andrew traveled to New York. He visited Epstein at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse on East 71st Street, a vast, ornate residence near Central Park that had once belonged to a prominent American diplomat, and that was also the place where much of the abuse had allegedly taken place. Andrew stayed there. He slept under Epstein's roof. And on one of those December days, with the trees stripped bare and the cold sharp enough to warrant heavy coats, the two men walked through Central Park together and were photographed by a long lens. The image is quiet, almost banal. Two men in winter coats moving through the park's pathways, framed by skeletal branches. There's no drama in the photograph, no confrontation, no visible tension. One was a registered sex offender, recently released from custody, still navigating the terms of a plea agreement that had outraged prosecutors and victims' advocates for its leniency. The other was the Queen of England's son, the Duke of York, a working royal, a British trade envoy with access to government intelligence and diplomatic channels. They looked like friends taking a walk. And that was the problem. Andrew would later tell the BBC that the visit was an attempt to end the friendship, that he had gone to Epstein's home to tell him, in person, that the relationship was over. He called it the honorable thing to do. He said staying at Epstein's Manhattan mansion had been convenient. He used that word, convenient, to describe sleeping in the home of a man convicted of sexual offenses against a minor. And he acknowledged, with the air of a man conceding a minor tactical error, that he had let the side down. But the Central Park photograph did not look like a farewell. It looked like two men at ease in each other's company, comfortable in each other's world, walking through the kind of afternoon that follows lunch, not confrontation. And for the palace, for the institution, for the family whose entire survival depended on the careful management of public perception, that image was a document they could never fully explain away. The consequences were slow at first, then irreversible. By 2011, the pressure from the Epstein connection, compounded by years of criticism over controversial contacts and lavish spending, forced Andrew out of the trade envoy role. He stepped down. The official framing was voluntary. The reality was that the position had become untenable. The prince whose value was access had become a liability precisely because of the access he had granted. Andrew was 51 years old. He had lost his public role. He had not yet lost his title, his residence, his military affiliations, his place on the palace balcony, or his mother's protection. Those losses were still coming, each one larger and more permanent than the last. But the first fracture had opened, and it would never close. The photograph from Central Park would surface again and again in the years that followed, in newspaper investigations, in court filings, in documentary footage, in the slow accumulation of a record that would eventually reach the doors of Royal Lodge itself. Andrew had told the world the New York meeting was goodbye. The emails suggested otherwise. And somewhere in the gap between his explanation and the documentary record, The story of the Queen's favorite son began its long, irreversible collapse. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. For 8 years after Andrew left the trade envoy role, the photograph from Central Park sat in the public record like a slow burning fuse. Other stories came and went. The royal family had its cycle of weddings, births, and managed crises. Andrew retreated into a smaller life, Royal Lodge, charity work, the occasional public appearance that drew little attention. The palace treated the Epstein connection as a contained embarrassment, a chapter closed by Andrew's departure from the trade role, managed by the same institutional machinery that had been absorbing royal scandals for centuries. Silence, distance, the quiet hope that the public would move on. And then Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again. On July 6, 2019, federal agents in New York took Epstein into custody on charges of sex trafficking of minors. The charges were not a rehash of the Florida case. They were new, broader, and built on testimony from dozens of accusers. Epstein was denied bail. The case promised what the 2008 plea deal had prevented: a full accounting in open court of the scope of his crimes and the identities of those in his orbit. For weeks, the world's attention turned to Epstein's network. His friends, his guests, his associates, the men who had flown on his planes and dined in his homes and accepted his hospitality without, they would later insist, knowing what was happening under the same roofs. Andrew's name was everywhere. Not as a defendant, not as a suspect, but as the most prominent face in Epstein's social world, the man whose royal title turned a sordid story into an international crisis. Virginia Giuffre's allegations, already part of the legal record, were re-examined with an intensity that the palace could no longer manage through press officers and official silence. On August 10th, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. His death was ruled a suicide. The trial that might have exposed the full machinery of his network would never take place. But the scrutiny did not end. It intensified. With Epstein gone, the public's attention shifted to those who had been closest to him, and no one in that circle carried a name more recognizable than Andrew. 3 months later, Andrew made the decision that would define the rest of his public life. On November 16th, 2019, the BBC aired a sit-down interview between Andrew and journalist Emily Maitlis for the program Newsnight. The interview had been arranged at Andrew's initiative. He wanted to address the Epstein connection himself, on his own terms, in a setting he believed he could control. It was filmed inside Buckingham Palace. The room was formal. The lighting was composed. Andrew sat in a chair that generations of royals had used to project authority. And for 49 minutes, he dismantled himself. Maitlis asked about Epstein. Andrew acknowledged the relationship. He acknowledged the visits to Epstein's homes, the flights, the island, the presence of Epstein at Windsor Castle in Sandringham. He was asked whether he regretted the friendship. His answer was the moment that would be replayed, quoted, dissected, and dramatized for years. He said he did not regret the relationship overall, because the people he met and the opportunities he was given through Epstein were very useful. He used that word, useful. He was speaking about a man convicted of procuring a minor for prostitution, a man who had died in a jail cell awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges, and the Duke of York's assessment of the relationship was that it had been useful. There is something about that word that is worth sitting with. It was not a slip. It was not taken out of context. It was Andrew's authentic evaluation, delivered calmly in a room inside the palace, with cameras recording. He spoke the language of a man who understood relationships as transactions, access exchanged for proximity, introductions traded for status, and who could not hear how that language sounded when the transaction involved a predator. He went further. He said he had no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre. He questioned the authenticity of the widely circulated photograph that appeared to show him with his arm around her waist at Ghislaine Maxwell's London townhouse. He described a medical condition, its inability to sweat, he claimed, resulting from an adrenaline overload during the Falklands War, as an explanation for why Giuffre's account of him sweating heavily on a dance floor at a London nightclub could not be accurate. He said that on this specific night, Giuffre alleged that she had been taken to him in London. He had been at a Pizza Express restaurant in Woking, Surrey, with his daughter Beatrice, celebrating after a children's party. The alibi was so specific, so mundane, and so impossible to verify nearly 2 decades after the fact that it became its own kind of devastation. A prince of the realm accused of sexual abuse, and his defense was a pizza restaurant in a commuter town. The detail did not exonerate him, it diminished him. It made the man, who had once projected naval confidence and royal authority, look like someone scrambling through the pages of an old diary for anything that might serve as a shield. Mateless pressed, Andrew held. The performance, and it was a performance however unintentional, lasted 49 minutes. Across those minutes, the audience watched something they had never quite seen from a senior member of the royal family. Not a carefully managed statement read by a press secretary, not a brief exchange at a rope line, but an extended, unfiltered encounter between a prince and an interviewer in which the prince's own words became the most damaging evidence against him. The interview was not an ambush. Andrew had chosen the setting, agreed to the terms, and believed he was clearing the air. That is what made it catastrophic. He had the chance to express moral clarity, to say plainly that Epstein's crimes were abhorrent and that he was wrong to have maintained the relationship. Instead, he spoke about convenience, usefulness, and the logistical benefits of staying at a sex offender's mansion. The public heard something very different from what Andrew thought he was saying. And the gap between those two versions, the prince's self-assessment and the audience's revulsion, was the space in which the last of his public life collapsed. 4 days later, on November 20th, 2019, Andrew announced that he would step back from public duties for the foreseeable future. The statement said the Epstein Association had become a major disruption to his family's work and to the charities he supported. Companies and organizations that had been associated with him began cutting ties within hours. The Duke of York, who had spent his adult life trading on access, found himself in a position where his association had become toxic. No one wanted the photograph anymore. Andrew was 59 years old. He retreated to Royal Lodge. The 30 rooms, the private grounds, the Windsor estate address that still signaled to anyone who understood the geography of British wealth that the man inside remained part of the inner circle even if the public doors had closed. The palace fell silent around him. The Queen, now 93, did not make a public statement. She did not need to. The institutional response was legible in what was absent. No defense, no clarification, no attempt to reframe the interview as misunderstood. The silence was its own verdict. The old system, discretion, containment, the management of embarrassment through withdrawal and the passage of time, was still holding, but only just. The question was no longer whether Andrew's relationship with Epstein represented poor judgment. The question was whether the institution that had sheltered him for 6 decades could absorb the full cost of what that judgment had produced, and whether the next generation of royal leadership, Charles, waiting in the wings, watching his brothers collapse with the grim patience of a man who had always known the crown would demand sacrifices, would be willing to pay that cost when the bill finally came due. The answer arrived in stages. In August 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a federal civil lawsuit against Andrew in the United States. She alleged that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had trafficked her to Andrew and that Andrew had sexually abused her when she was 17 years old. The filing was specific. It named dates, locations, and the nature of the alleged abuse. Andrew denied all allegations. His legal team initially attempted to have the case dismissed, arguing that a prior settlement Giuffre had reached with Epstein released Andrew from liability. The court disagreed. The case would proceed. For the palace, the lawsuit was an existential threat of a kind the monarchy had not faced in modern memory. Not a tabloid scandal, not a press crisis, a civil trial in an American courtroom with the Queen's son as the defendant, testimony under oath, cross-examination, and the prospect of Virginia Giuffre telling her story in a setting where royal protocol could not help and palace press officers could not intervene. In January 2022, the Queen acted. She stripped Andrew of his military affiliations and royal patronages, the honorary colonel positions, the ceremonial titles, the institutional connections that had survived every previous round of scandal. The announcement was terse and final. The favorite son was being cut loose, not by the press, not by the public, but by his own mother. Elizabeth was 95 years old. She had spent 7 decades protecting the institution. She would not let it fall for Andrew. 1 month later, in February 2022, Andrew and Giuffre reached an out-of-court settlement. The terms included an undisclosed financial payment and a substantial donation to Virginia Giuffre's charity supporting victims' rights. Andrew expressed regret for his association with Epstein and acknowledged Giuffre as an established victim of abuse. The settlement was not an admission of liability. Andrew continued to deny her allegations, but there would be no trial, no sworn testimony, no courtroom confrontation. The monarchy had traded money for silence, not Giuffre's silence, but the silence of a legal process that would have forced Andrew to answer questions under oath. The cost of that trade was permanent ambiguity. The allegations did not go away, they could not be tested in a courtroom, and they could not be resolved by a jury. The settlement closed the case but left the question open, and open questions in public life are often more damaging than verdicts. A trial might have produced exoneration, a trial might have produced a finding of liability. Either outcome would have been definitive. The settlement produced neither. It produced instead an endless present tense. The allegations exist, the denial exists, the money changed hands, and no one outside the lawyer's offices knows what the truth is. Andrew would carry that ambiguity for the rest of his public life, and the palace would discover that paying for silence does not purchase resolution. And still the story was not finished. A second pattern was emerging, one that had nothing to do with Epstein and everything to do with the same structural failure: Andrew's appetite for men who wanted access to royal power. In 2024, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission in the United Kingdom heard a case involving a Chinese businessman initially known only as H6 and later identified as Yang Tengbo. Yang had been barred from the UK on national security grounds. He denied wrongdoing. But the case revealed that Yang had cultivated an unusually close relationship with Andrew, close enough that security officials were concerned it could be leveraged for political interference. Andrew had given Yang a degree of trust and proximity that alarmed the people whose job it was to assess such risks. The Yang case was not a carbon copy of the Epstein relationship, it was a rhyme. A different man, a different set of concerns, but the same underlying dynamic. Andrew operating in a space where personal relationships and national interests blurred together, and where his judgment about whom to trust had once again failed. Epstein was the moral scandal. Yang was the national security scandal. Together, they made Andrew's network look less like a series of unfortunate friendships and more like a recurring pattern. A man who could not distinguish between the people who wanted him and the people who wanted what he represented. Then came the loss that no institution could manage. In April 2025, Virginia Giuffre died by suicide. She was 41 years old. Her family confirmed the cause of death. She had spent more than a decade fighting publicly for accountability, through lawsuits, through depositions, through testimony before lawyers and journalists, through media appearances in which she looked into cameras and said what she said had happened to her and who she said had done it. She had been called a liar, a gold digger, a fantasist. She had persisted. She had refused to let the powerful men in Epstein's orbit escape scrutiny simply because their names were larger than hers. And then she was gone, at an age when most people are still building the middle chapters of their lives. Her death landed with a weight that transcended the legal case. She was not an abstraction. She was not a tabloid figure. She was not a line item in a court filing. She was a person who had alleged terrible things, who had been told by the most powerful family in Britain that she was mistaken, who had fought for years to be heard, and who did not live to see the full consequences of what her fight had set in motion. Her memoir, Nobody's Girl, was published later that year. It sold more than 1 million copies worldwide within 2 months of release. The book renewed public attention to her allegations and to Andrew's denials with an intensity that the settlement had been designed to prevent. Giuffre's voice, silenced by her death, continued speaking in print, and the book became a document the palace could not answer, could not settle, could not discredit, and could not outlast. On October 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace issued a statement. King Charles, who had ascended to the throne in September 2022 following Elizabeth's death, had initiated the formal process to remove Andrew's remaining style, titles, and honors. Andrew would no longer be known as His Royal Highness. He would no longer be referred to as Prince Andrew or the Duke of York. He would be known officially as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The palace had also served formal notice for him to surrender the lease on Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate where he had lived for more than 2 decades. The statement noted, with the cold precision of institutional language, that these censures were necessary notwithstanding Andrew's continued denial of the allegations against him. That sentence, notwithstanding his denial, carried the full weight of the institutional decision. The palace was not adjudicating guilt. It was not declaring Andrew a liar. It was saying that the denial no longer mattered. The accumulation, Epstein, Jouffre, the interview, the settlement, Yang, the memoir, the documents, the public revulsion, had overwhelmed every defense the family and its advisors could construct. Charles was doing what Elizabeth had begun but could not finish, cutting Andrew away from the monarchy itself. Not merely from duties, not merely from patronages, from the name. Andrew was 65 years old. He had been born a prince. He had been made a duke. He had been a war hero, a trade envoy, a father, and a favorite son. And now he was Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private citizen whose remaining public identity was defined by allegations he denied, a settlement he had paid, and an institution that no longer wished to carry him. That should have been the end of the story. A slow, grinding diminishment, title by title, residence by residence, year by year, until the man who had once stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony in naval dress was simply gone from public life. It was not the end. On February 19th, 2026, Andrew's 66th birthday, British police arrived at the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. Andrew had already moved out of Royal Lodge by this point. He was living in temporary accommodation on the Sandringham grounds, a quieter, smaller existence than the one he had known for most of his adult life. Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion, with the 75-year lease, the gardens and the private grounds, and the staff who had maintained the property for decades had already become part of the loss. The man who had once hosted Jeffrey Epstein at Windsor Castle was now a guest on his own family's estate, occupying rooms that were not his, in a house that did not carry his name. He was no longer a prince in a palace. He was a man in borrowed rooms, 66 years old that morning, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was a knock on the door. Officers arrested Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The allegation was believed to relate to claims that he had passed sensitive government documents to Jeffrey Epstein during his time as the UK's special representative for international trade and investment, the very role that had been designed to give the royal spare a purpose, the role that had sent him into rooms full of wealthy, powerful, and sometimes compromised men. The investigation was not about the sexual abuse allegations. It was about something the institution had feared even more: the possibility that Andrew's relationship with Epstein had compromised national security, that the door-opening prince had opened the wrong doors, not merely to his social world, but to the state's secrets. He was taken into custody that morning. He remained there for almost 10 hours. He was then released under investigation, not charged, not cleared, suspended in the procedural limbo that the British legal system uses when an arrest has been made, but the evidence has not yet reached the threshold for formal charges. Officers searched 2 properties linked to him, one in Norfolk, where the search was completed that day, and his former Windsor home, where the examination continued. Picture the scene for a moment, because the contrast is the point. A birthday. February in Norfolk, the light pale and cold, the Sandringham grounds bare and wintry. No balcony, no uniform, no title. A man who had been born second in line to the throne, who had flown helicopters in a war, who had shaken hands with presidents and prime ministers and business leaders on 6 continents, was being processed through the same procedure that applies to any citizen suspected of a criminal offense. Fingerprints, photographs, legal caution, the reading of rights. 10 hours in a room where birthright meant nothing, and the questions were not about protocol but about documents, emails, and what had been shared with a dead man whose name had become synonymous with abuse. While Andrew sat in custody, King Charles III issued a statement through the royal household. The king said he had learned with deepest concern of the news about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. He acknowledged the suspicion of misconduct in public office. He said the process should be investigated properly and that the authorities had the family's full support and cooperation. And then the final line, 7 words that carried the weight of a family rupture decades in the making: the law must take its course. There is something about the language of that statement that must be understood. Charles did not call Andrew his brother. He used the full civilian name, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the name the palace had assigned when it stripped the royal styling 4 months earlier. He did not express faith in Andrew's innocence. He did not offer a personal defense. He spoke as the institution, not as the family. The statement was constitutional, not fraternal. A king who had waited his entire life to protect the monarchy had concluded publicly that protecting his brother was no longer compatible with that duty. And the public response was not simple outrage. It was something quieter and more structural. A shift in what people believed the monarchy could protect. For decades and for generations, the royal family had used distance, silence, and managed withdrawal to contain its embarrassments. Scandals were absorbed. Disgraces were softened. Problematic members were moved to the margins, given smaller homes, quieter lives, reduced visibility until the public forgot or forgave. That model had worked for abdications, for divorces, for financial embarrassments, for affairs. It had not worked for documents. It had not worked for emails. It had not worked for a dead man's archive that the United States Department of Justice was still releasing file by file into the public record. By April 2026, British police investigating Andrew and former government minister Peter Mandelson were preparing witness interviews. Prosecutors, however, faced a problem. The original unredacted Epstein documents were held by the DOJ, and obtaining them would require a formal, lengthy international request process. Both Andrew and Mandelson had been arrested and released and were understood to deny wrongdoing. The investigation had not concluded. The charges had not been filed. The documents had not all been read. The story did not end with a verdict. It ended with a system waiting on files. And that is where the central tragedy sits, not in a single dramatic act, but in the slow institutional exposure of a man whose entire life had been built on the assumption that the institution would hold. Andrew had been born into a family that could absorb almost anything. He had watched it absorb his mother's grief, his brother's loneliness, his sister-in-law's despair, his own divorce, and decades of tabloid cruelty. He had assumed, perhaps unconsciously, that it would absorb this too. It did not. The monarchy survived. Andrew did not. The law must take its course. But law moves slower than reputation. By the time investigators began looking for the documents that would determine whether charges were warranted, the family had already delivered its own sentence. The title was gone. The residence was gone. The name was stripped to its plainest form. And somewhere in a temporary room on the Sandringham estate, a man who had once been second in line to the throne of the United Kingdom spent his 66th birthday answering questions he had spent a lifetime believing he would never have to face. The statement stayed on the royal household's website through the night and into the next morning. The language unchanged, the words immovable. The law must take its course. By the time the British press had processed the arrest, the searches, and the king's response, the public was already beginning to understand that this was not a story that would end with a verdict delivered in a courtroom on a specific afternoon. It was a story that would end, if it ended at all, in the slow machinery of international legal cooperation, redacted documents, witness interviews, and the grinding patience of investigators trying to reconstruct what a prince may or may not have shared with a dead man 2 decades earlier. The investigation's shape became clearer in the weeks that followed. The allegation was misconduct in public office, a common law offense in England and Wales that carries no maximum sentence, that requires proof of willful misconduct by a public office holder, and that depends in Andrew's case on demonstrating that sensitive government material was passed to Epstein during Andrew's years as trade envoy. The charge is rarely brought against figures of Andrew's profile. It is the kind of offense associated with corrupt local officials, bent police officers, prison staff who smuggle contraband, people who abuse the trust of their public position for private gain or improper purpose. The fact that it was being applied to a former prince of the realm, a man who had once represented the British government in trade negotiations across dozens of countries, carried a weight that went beyond the legal specifics. It said something about how far Andrew had fallen, not in the eyes of the tabloids, which had been writing him off for years, but in the eyes of the law itself. The evidence trail led back to emails, to meetings, to the kind of documentary record that governments produce in vast quantities and that individuals rarely expect to see resurface. Andrew had operated in a world of briefing papers, diplomatic cables, trade intelligence, and government contacts. He had received information that was not public. He had attended meetings where national commercial interests were discussed, with the expectation that the contents would remain confidential. Epstein, meanwhile, had operated in a world of leverage, connection, and the accumulation of information about powerful people. A man who collected relationships the way others collect art, not for the beauty of them, but for what they might be worth when the time came. The investigation's central question was whether those two worlds had intersected in ways that went beyond social friendship and into the territory of official misconduct, whether Andrew had, knowingly or carelessly, allowed material from his government role to flow to a man who should never have received it. The answer depended, in large part, on documents that were not in British hands. The United States Department of Justice maintained an Epstein library, a repository of materials released under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, updated as recently as April 23, 2026. The library contained thousands of pages, financial records, flight logs, correspondence, scheduling documents, and material that had been gathered across multiple federal investigations. Some of it was redacted to protect victim identities and sensitive information. Some of it was searchable. Much of it was not. The DOJ had warned that the volume of records was vast, that technical limitations affected searchability, and that the library would continue to be updated as additional materials became available. For British investigators, the library was both a resource and an obstacle. The publicly released materials could inform the investigation, but the original unredacted documents, the versions with full names, full dates, and full contents, were held by the DOJ and could not be obtained without a formal mutual legal assistance request. That process, under ordinary circumstances, takes months. Under circumstances involving a former member of the British royal family and the diplomatic sensitivities that attach to such a case, it could take considerably longer. By April 2026, reporting indicated that prosecutors feared the absence of those unredacted files could make it difficult to bring charges, even if the publicly available evidence suggested a case worth pursuing. The investigation was not stalled. It was waiting, and the waiting was, in its own way, a kind of sentence. Not a legal one, but a personal one, suspending Andrew in a space where he could neither be cleared nor convicted, where every day without resolution extended the period of public suspicion. Meanwhile, a second allegation had surfaced, quieter than the arrest, but no less damaging to what remained of Andrew's account of his relationship with Epstein. Thames Valley Police was assessing a new claim that a woman had allegedly been sent by Epstein to Andrew at Royal Lodge in 2010. The same year as the Central Park meeting, the same period when Andrew maintained he was ending the friendship, the same year the emails showed him arranging to drop by New York. Andrew had not commented on that specific allegation. He had previously denied all wrongdoing related to Epstein. But the claim added another layer to a story that kept producing new details long after the principals believed it had been contained. Royal Lodge, the address that had been Andrew's home for more than 20 years, was no longer merely a former residence. It was a location in an active investigation, a place where officers had searched and where allegations now attached to the rooms and corridors like a second history written over the first. The geography of Andrew's life had contracted to its smallest possible dimensions. He had been born at Buckingham Palace. He had grown up between Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and Balmoral. He had lived at Sunninghill Park after his marriage, then at Royal Lodge after the divorce, a 30-room Georgian mansion on the Windsor Great Park estate, surrounded by gardens that had once been tended for the Queen Mother, with a 75-year lease that had seemed, when it was granted, like a guarantee of permanence. Royal Lodge had been Andrew's anchor for more than 2 decades. It was where his daughters had spent their childhood weekends. It was where Sarah had continued to live, on and off, in the unusual domestic arrangement that defined the York family long after the divorce. It was where, if the newer allegation was accurate, Epstein's network had extended its reach into the most private spaces of Andrew's life. And now it was gone. The lease had been surrendered. The mansion that had represented security, status, and the lingering protection of the royal name was now a searched address, an item in a police file, a place Andrew had been told to leave. He had traveled the world as a naval officer and a trade envoy, sleeping in embassies and 5-star hotels, and on at least several occasions, in the homes of men whose wealth was entangled with their crimes. Now he was at Sandringham, in Norfolk, in temporary accommodation, with a further move expected and no public indication of where that move would take him. The man who had once been hosted by heads of state was now a man whose address was uncertain and whose future was defined by the pace of an investigation he could not control. Charles, for his part, had completed the institutional severance that the monarchy required. The October 2025 statement removing Andrew's titles had been the administrative cut. The February 2026 statement after the arrest had been the emotional one. Together, they represented something the British monarchy had not done in living memory, a reigning sovereign publicly and formally expelling a sibling from the royal identity. Charles had not merely distanced himself from Andrew. He had used the language of the institution to redefine Andrew's relationship to the family itself. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was not Prince Andrew on leave. He was not the Duke of York in temporary disgrace. He was a private citizen, named as such by his own brother, the king, in a statement that offered no warmth, no personal loyalty, and no room for reinterpretation. The emotional cost of that decision was not visible in the statement's language because the statement was designed to make the cost invisible. But Charles was 77 years old. He had waited longer than any heir in British history to reach the throne. He had inherited a monarchy that was already under pressure from public skepticism, from generational change, from the departure of Harry and Meghan, from the steady erosion of deference that had sustained the institution for centuries. And now he had to cut off his own brother to keep the institution intact. Whether that decision caused him private grief or private relief or some combination that only siblings of a certain age and a certain shared history can understand, the public would never know. Charles spoke as king. The brother disappeared behind the crown. The broader implications for the monarchy were not lost on constitutional observers or on the public. For centuries, the British royal family had operated on an implicit bargain. The family members surrendered normal privacy and personal freedom, and in return, the institution provided protection: financial, legal, social, reputational. That bargain had survived wars, abdications, divorces, and tabloid exposés. What it hadn't survived was the combination of digital age transparency and a documentary record that could be searched, released, cross-referenced, and preserved indefinitely. Andrew's case was not merely a family scandal. It was a test case for whether the oldest continuous monarchy in Europe could adapt to a world where information moved faster than protocol, where files outlasted the men who created them, and where the public's tolerance for institutional protection of powerful individuals had fundamentally changed. The old model: absorb the embarrassment, wait for the news cycle to move on, deploy silence as a strategy, had broken. Andrew was the proof. Sarah Ferguson's position was, as it had been for decades, defined by proximity to a man whose public identity was collapsing. She and Andrew had divorced 30 years earlier, but the emotional and domestic entanglement had never fully resolved. For years after the divorce, Sarah had faced her own public difficulties. Financial problems that led to embarrassing tabloid exposures, a sting operation in which she was filmed appearing to offer access to Andrew in exchange for money, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a public identity after the loss of the royal one. She had written children's books. She had appeared on television. She had worked with charities. She had survived a cancer diagnosis. Through all of it, she had remained loyal to Andrew and close to their daughters, maintaining the private family unit that existed independently of the institutional one. That loyalty persisted through the Epstein revelations, through the Newsnight interview, through the settlement, through the title removal, through the arrest. It was part of her identity as a York, not the institutional York, which no longer existed, but the family York, the private arrangement of parents and daughters and shared history that persisted even after the public version had been dismantled. The cost of that loyalty was that Sarah's own public life remained permanently shadowed by Andrew's scandal. She was not accused of anything. She was not under investigation. She had not been part of the Epstein relationship or the trade envoy role or any of the decisions that had brought the police to Sandringham. But she was the mother of his children and the woman who had stood closest to him for the longest, and in the arithmetic of public association, that proximity carried its own weight. Every interview she gave, every public appearance she made, carried the unspoken asterisk of her connection to a man whose name had become synonymous with scandal. Beatrice and Eugenie bore the most complex inheritance of all. They were princesses, still formally styled as such, but their father was no longer a prince. They carried the York name in public, but the York title their father had held was, in practical terms, gone. They had grown up in the warmth of the family unit that Andrew and Sarah had maintained even after the divorce, in the houses and holidays and rituals that defined a particular kind of upper-class English childhood. And now the family name that had shaped their entire lives carried a different set of associations. Not the balcony, not the uniform, not the wedding photograph, but the interview, the settlement, the arrest, the questions. They had done nothing wrong. They had created none of this. And yet the public record that would follow them, their children, for the rest of their lives was not the record of a proud naval family or a glamorous royal marriage. It was the record of a father who could not stop befriending dangerous men, and an institution that eventually decided the cost of protecting him was greater than the cost of letting him fall. That is the inheritance that is not money. It is patterns, silences, public records, and the particular kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love become a name that people use as shorthand for scandal. The cultural afterlife of Andrew's story had already begun while the investigation was still underway. The BBC Newsnight interview The 49 minutes that had destroyed Andrew's public credibility had been dramatized in Netflix's Film Scoop, which brought the interview back to a global audience and reframed it as a media event of historic proportions. The film reconstructed the negotiation that led to the interview, the palace advisors who warned against it, and the extraordinary spectacle of a senior royal sitting down to explain his friendship with a convicted sex offender on national television. It captured the interview as a disaster of self presentation, a case study in what happens when a person accustomed to deference encounters genuine scrutiny for the first time in his life. But the adaptation, like all adaptations, compressed the larger story into one dramatic episode. That compression was part of its appeal. The Newsnight interview was a contained event with a beginning, a middle, and a devastating conclusion, but it also obscured the deeper truth. The real story was not one bad interview. It was not a communications failure or a tactical error. It was decades of royal access used carelessly, questionable friendships maintained past the point of defensibility, allegations that would not disappear regardless of how much money was spent or how many titles were withdrawn, settlements that purchased ambiguity instead of resolution, documents that kept emerging from government archives years and decades after the events they recorded, and an institution that moved with glacial slowness when its instincts said to absorb and then moved with surgical precision when survival demanded amputation. The Newsnight interview was the moment the public saw the collapse. The collapse itself had been building for 30 years. Virginia Giuffre was absent from all of this. She had died 11 months before Andrew's arrest. She did not see the police arrive at Sandringham. She did not see the king's statement. She did not see the investigation that her persistence had, in part, made possible. Her memoir continued to sell, her allegations continued to shape the public narrative. Her name appeared in every report about Andrew's case, attached to every summary of the accusations, invoked in every discussion about what the Epstein documents might reveal. She was gone, but her voice, the voice that had refused to be silenced by wealth, by title, by institutional pressure, by the sheer imbalance of power between a teenager from Florida and a prince of the United Kingdom, continued to speak through the pages she had left behind. One woman gone at 41, one book still moving through the world, one royal title removed after decades of protection. Those three facts, placed together, form the outline of something that resists simple narration. It is not justice. It is not closure. It is what happens when a story outlives the people who tried to contain it. The Epstein library remained active. New materials were being added. Redactions were being challenged in court by journalists and advocacy organizations who argued that the public interest in transparency outweighed the privacy claims that had kept certain names and details hidden. Researchers continued to comb through the release files, looking for names, dates, connections, and the kind of documentary evidence that turns suspicion into certainty, or just as importantly, that fails to and leaves the question unresolved. The archive was not a sealed record, it was a living repository, expanding and shifting as the legal and political pressures around it evolved. For Andrew, and for everyone connected to Epstein's network, the library represented a permanent, uncontrollable threat, the possibility that something not yet public, something still buried in the unredacted files, something that the DOJ had not yet released, or that British investigators had not yet obtained, could change the story again. Every batch of newly released documents carried the potential for new names, new connections, new evidence of what had happened in the houses and on the planes and at the dinners, where powerful men had accepted Epstein's hospitality. The ground beneath Andrew had not stopped shifting. It might never stop. That is the nature of a documentary record that belongs not to the people it describes, but to the government that holds it. It exists on its own timeline, indifferent to the reputations it might destroy or the institutions it might embarrass, waiting to be read by whoever has the authority and the patience to ask for it. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor is 66 years old. He lives on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, in accommodation that is temporary and whose permanence no one has publicly confirmed. He has not been charged with a crime. He remains under investigation for suspicion of misconduct in public office. He continues to deny all allegation related to Jeffrey Epstein. He has no public role, no royal title in practical use, no military affiliations, no patronages, no seat at state occasions, and no visible path back to the life he lived before the photograph in Central Park, the interview at Buckingham Palace, and the knock on the door on his 66th birthday. He is, in the language the palace chose for him, simply Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The surname, a combination of his mother's family and his father's adopted name, stripped of every prefix and every title that once announced, before he entered a room, that he mattered. King Charles III is 77. He reigns over a monarchy that has survived the scandal of his brother, but the survival required a kind of institutional ruthlessness that the previous reign had been reluctant to deploy. His public language about Andrew has hardened into something that sounds less like family and more like statute. He speaks of process, of law, of the institution's cooperation with authorities. He does not speak of his brother as his brother. He does not speak of him at all if he can help it. Whether that is discipline or grief or both, the public language does not say. The king's task in the years ahead is not merely to reign, but to demonstrate that the monarchy can police itself, that the institution that once sheltered Andrew will not shelter the next one. Sarah Ferguson remains entangled with the York story in ways that neither divorce nor disgrace have severed. She is 66 years old. Her public life continues: charity work, television appearances, the books she writes and promotes, but it continues in the long shadow of a family name she once wore with delight and that now carries associations she did not create and cannot escape. She has not spoken publicly about the arrest. She has not distanced herself from Andrew. The loyalty that defined her role in the York family for 3 decades appears to endure, even now, even after everything. Princess Beatrice is 37. Princess Eugenie is 36. They are mothers now, raising their own children in a world where their father's name triggers associations they cannot control and did not create. They have maintained their distance from the public dimensions of the scandal with the kind of quiet discipline that their grandmother would have recognized. The discipline of silence, of non-engagement, of allowing the institution to speak for itself while building private lives that do not depend on its machinery. Their lives continue. The inheritance continues with them, not money, not title, but the weight of a public record that will follow the name York for as long as anyone alive remembers what it came to mean. Virginia Giuffre is not here. She is not anywhere. She was 41 years old when she died. Her memoir, Nobody's Girl, remains in print. Her allegations remain unresolved by any court of law. Her name remains attached to Andrews in every account of this story, not because she sought fame, but because she refused to accept silence as the price of proximity to power. She is the absence at the center of the aftermath, the person whose fight made the reckoning possible, and who did not survive to see it reach its conclusion. And this, finally, is what the story of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor reveals: that a palace can protect a man from embarrassment, from tabloid cruelty, from the ordinary consequences of bad judgment, and from the scrutiny that would destroy someone without a title and a family name, but it cannot protect him from documents. Andrew had birth, military honor, royal access, trade authority, a mother who loved him more visibly than she loved anyone else, and a family whose institutional machinery had been absorbing scandal for 1,000 years. What he did not have in the end was immunity from the record, from the emails, the photographs, the flight logs, the testimony of a woman who refused to stay silent, and the